Hello, I'm Liz Barnes, and tonight I'm joined by a prog legend who is currently out with Jethro Tull on the 7 Decades tour. It's Ian Anderson. Ian Anderson, welcome to a programme you have been on, let's say, more than twice.
That's very possible. Very possible. I don't count these moments of chance encounter with the magic world of radio, so I'll take your word for it.
Also, you're a big friend of the station because not only have you been on My Planet Rocks more than once, you also had your own programme.
Yeah, I believe I did at some point, and that was a distant memory. But anyway, fire away. How can I help you? What are we going to talk about?
Well, Ian, I think it's not helping me, but it's helping the listeners, because I think we maybe need to sort of fill them in on the fact that you've announced the 7 Decades tour. I mean, we're used to bands talking about 5 decades, possibly even 6. Now we're getting into 7. This is sort of getting into real legendary territory. I mean, how does it feel for you to be saying those words, 7 decades?
A great relief to find something that I could hang the name of a tour around that was actually A, truthful, and B, sounded incredibly impressive. But the reality is that that's what we're doing right now, and we feature, at least one song from each of the decades that Jethro Tull has been active, from the late 1960s through to the early 2020s. We're trying obviously to keep a varied set list that showcases some of the key elements musically, but they've got to balance out. They've got to be in a variety of keys, time signatures, tempos, so that there is a sense of light and shade and some dynamics within the performance.
You've given us a lovely list of tracks here to listen to, as well as chat about Jethro Tull in general. So in order to fit them all in, we better start with one. Let's start with your choice of Roy Harper. This is from 1967. You chose You Don't Need Money. Why this one?
Well, when 1967, in December, I moved south from Blackpool with a few members of what had been the John Evan Band to attempt to form Jethro Tull, which began at the Marquee Club in January of 1968. And Roy was from the part of the world we had come from, and I bought Roy's album Come Out Fighting Genghis Smith and was captivated by, well, all the songs on the album, but the one that resonated for me at the time, because this was the beginning of a warm, sunny summer where I would sojourn on Hampstead Heath and Highgate Cemetery and other places, which were no strangers to Roy Harper and his songs, and wander through Soho. And so the song You Don't Need Money is very fitting in terms of my memories of my own first few months living by then in London.
All the focused student population wearing rucksacks.
Just sort of while we're on that particular era or that kind of time, I have a feeling when I've spoken to you before and we've spoken about the flute, we've also spoken about, I think it was Eric Clapton, wasn't it, who was your inspiration to move from guitar to flute. Am I right? Or was it Hendrix?
Primarily, yes. I mean, it was hearing Eric Clapton in his early days with John Mayall's Blues Breakers that sealed the matter for me that I wasn't going to be that good in the months to come, at any rate, and so I better find something else to play. But worse than Eric Clapton, in a way, there were a whole bunch of other guys who were streets ahead of me, like Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page and Ritchie Blackmore, all of whom were session guys in the London area. So, rather than be a very small fish in a big pool, I thought, let's take the opposite view and pick an instrument that nobody else is really featuring prominently in the world of blues or rock, and maybe I'll get noticed, which indeed was the case. And Jethro Tull was quickly noticed in the early days at the Marquee Club, and people began to write about us. And eventually in the summer of that year, we made a record. it was then hawked around, and Chris Blackwell at Island Records took it up, and the rest is a very minor footnote in history.
But that was the first of 23, am I right? The first of 23 albums?
I don't know. I don't really count things like that.
I think, I'm always worried when I count up studio albums and, and then say it out loud on a radio program, because somebody somewhere will say, I think you'll find you've missed, even if it's not you, it might be a listener. But I'm thinking it's 23 studio albums over the Jethro Tull career. The reason I mentioned Clapton is because you've chosen Cream and you've chosen Tales of Brave Ulysses from Disraeli Gears. Is that for the song or for the lyrics or just for the whole thing?
The nature of that song, it is an unusual piece. It owes quite a lot in terms of musical similarity to another Cream song called White Room. But I rather prefer Tales of Brave Ulysses simply because it sounds a little grander and it has some really interesting off-the-wall time signature short bars and weird drum breaks from Ginger Baker, which struck me at the time and still do when I occasionally hear it to this day. So I rather think it was one of their more creative efforts, and probably this was a move into something that we didn't yet know that we should call progressive rock. But yeah, Tales of Brave Ulysses is one that absolutely plants the signpost in the middle of the road saying, "This way, all ye who think you might do something a little different and get paid for it."
That's Cream and Tales of Brave Ulysses, as chosen by my guest Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull. He'll be bringing us his 7 Decades tour to the UK in April next year. On the way next, more of Ian's choices on My Planet Rocks. Certainly around, obviously, as you mentioned, the Marquee and Chris Blackwell and that particular time, none of you sat there at the time saying, yeah, in 50 years, we'll still be doing this. I mean, that didn't really enter your head, I'm assuming?
Well, it kind of entered my head fairly early on that since all my musical heroes tended to be old guys, that perhaps there was a long career in music to be at least hoped for. I guess I just felt like, well, I'll hopefully join the club.
Well, someone else as well, who, isn't far away and has certainly had a lot of attention over the past couple of months for just how, of sort of reminding people how brilliant he could be by doing the Legends slot at Glastonbury, is Cat Stevens. I think that's one of the most exciting things to me of the past 5 years, is that he single-handedly reminded everybody, and lots of people who didn't know who he was, of this amazing back catalogue by just sitting there on a Sunday afternoon at Glastonbury and just being brilliant. And you've chosen some Cat Stevens in your track list. You've chosen Sad Lisa. How did you come across him?
Cat Stevens, I got to meet him a couple of times along the way, and he was a nice guy. Something must have impressed him about me, because when he decided to pack it all in and become a full-time Muslim, some lackey arrived at my studio in London, knocking on the door saying, I want to drop off a harpsichord. And I said, really? Well, why? I haven't ordered a harpsichord. What's that for? He said, well, Steve asked me to bring it to you, and he wants you to have it. I said, Steve? Steve who? He said, Steve. Well, Cat Stevens. I said, he wants me to have his harpsichord? And he said, yeah, he's giving away all of his instruments. He's giving them away to people that he likes and who he thinks might use them. And but he doesn't want to keep them anymore. He's given up music due to his religious beliefs. So I thought for a few seconds. I said, well, look, I really don't want to sound offensive, but I don't want him to give up music. I want him to put it into cold storage, keep it safely somewhere, just in case things change, just in case he has a different mindset a few years from now. So off the lackey went, and I heard no more from Cat Stevens until I bumped into him. I think it was when quite possibly when the Olympic Games was on in Athens in Greece, and in some pre-games special concerts, I went over to him and said, hey, nice to see you again. It's Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull. And he looked at me completely blankly and sort of turned away. And I thought, well, that's a bit embarrassing. Anyway, his son then came running over to say, oh, I'm terribly sorry. He said, Dad didn't realize it was you. He just thought someone was pretending to be you. And I realized it really was you. And he's so embarrassed. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't want to come over and say hello now because he's so embarrassed that he didn't recognize you. And then went over to him and said, hey, nice to see you again. At which point he then did obviously sort of look a bit sheepish and embarrassed. And happily, in some years to come, he did find his way back into performing live music again and recording. And I think the world is a better place for his renewed engagement, not only with the old fans from the 70s, but with a younger generation of people who will remember the brilliant simplicity and the poignancy of Sad Lisa. And I did, in fact, ask Cat Stevens, who is this about? Who is the Lisa in question? And he just looked sheepish again.
She hangs her head and cries in my shirt.
Ian Anderson is with me on My Planet Rocks tonight, and we're going through we're skimming the surface of some of Ian's most treasured tracks. Captain Beefheart, you've got here. I've heard you speak about Captain Beefheart before, but just remind us a little bit about sort of how you became a fan. You've chosen Big Eyed Beans from Venus, but how did you first come across them?
Well, I first heard Captain Beefheart and his magic band on John Peel's radio show on a Sunday afternoon. I was on a US tour, I think, at the beginning of 1979, and I perhaps mentioned to somebody at one of the record companies that I had a soft spot for Beefheart and his wacko music, and my telephone rang, and somewhere in the motel in the Midwest, the phone went off in the night, and a gruff voice said, hey, this is your captain, Captain Beefheart. So I said, yes, Don Van Vliet. It's nice to hear from you. How can I help? And he said, well, I hear you're going out on tour, and we would really like to join you on tour and open for Jethro Tull. So Beefheart suffered for the length of a long US tour at a time when they just released the Clear Spot album. And I had a huge liking for the guys in the band, particularly Zoothorn Rollo. Bill Harkleroad was his real name, who is the guitar player in Big Eyed Beans from Venus, from the Clear Spot album of 1972, the year we toured together. And Bill, did have that wonderful way of coming up with strange guitar lines that nobody else in the world would. Yet they all made perfect sense in the context of the very strange music that Beefheart presented to the band in demo form, and they had to try and bring to life as some kind of organized musical adventure. But Clear Spot marks the point where it's beginning to become much more cohesive and a little easier, commercially speaking, on the average member of an audience. But Big Eyed Beans from Venus is the perfect balance of wacko weird and yet strangely commercially acceptable.
Distant cousins.
I feel like the natural place to go from Captain Beefheart is Frank Zappa.
I know that obviously Frank Zappa and Beefheart were briefly joined at the hip for a weeks or months maximum, but they fell out big time. Everybody fell out with Don Van Vliet. Frank, everybody had a huge loyalty to all the musicians he played with. Everybody spoke really highly of him and his skills, his ability. And he wrote scathingly about some of the British bands of that era, like Led Zeppelin and Jethro Tull, for example. And I took it a little bit to heart because I was a big Zappa fan in the early 70s. And then suddenly hearing that your hero thinks very, very little of you and your work is a little disappointing. But I put it to one side until much later on when I heard Frank Zappa was suffering from terminal prostate cancer. And I got a phone call from one of his ex-musicians saying, "Hey, Frank wants you to call him." And I said, "Really? I don't know Frank." He said, "Well, this is his phone number, and he'd really like to speak to you." So I wrote down the phone number, and on 3 different occasions I dialed his phone number from some hotel room in the middle of America. And before it could pick up, I panicked and put the phone down, because I don't know what you say to a dying man you've never met before. And I just didn't have the guts to do it, which I deeply, deeply regret to this day, that I didn't speak to Frank, because I don't know what he wanted to say, but maybe he just wanted to say hi. We never met, and now we never will. So it was a poignant moment that unfortunately I chickened out of, and I deeply regret that.
Your place or mine.
Yes.
Just taking a look at some of the other tracks that you've chosen, Ian, the musical journey that this takes us on is completely fascinating, because I'm going to go straight to 1977 now, and we leap straight from Zappa to the Stranglers, which is a bit of a gear change, but equally, I could probably imagine them hanging out at some point. I presume they didn't. You've chosen Peaches. Why the Stranglers? Why this one?
Well, there are those bands that are unlikely focuses of interest from different artists. I mean, to find out that Johnny Rotten was a big fan of the Aqualung album was a surprise. And probably for, the Roxy Music, it would be a surprise that I was a fan of their first album when it had appeared. With the Stranglers, the song Peaches is the one that really kicks everything off. And Hugh Cornwell, who's one of the baddest boys in rock music, he subsequently, many years later, became a big buddy, and we performed together in one of the cathedrals. It wasn't Salisbury. It was whatever it was. It was a Wells Cathedral. That's right. Yes, and Hugh and we were met up for supper and chatted, and of course, in reality, he's a very mild-mannered, polite guy who, like me, a bit of a loner. He doesn't make friends easily, and he doesn't tend to hang out. But he's, when he's in the mood, he can be, as I am, moderately good company over a hot curry or a damn Italian. And I looking back at all of his music, and I played actually on a couple of his solo albums in more recent years. He is one of the great songwriters, and like me, a natural baritone. He sings round here most of the time, and it's cheerful to hear a good baritone singing, because most rock tenors sing in a key that is way too high for me to sing. In spite of having tried a few times, it's just beyond me. And so I feel I'm part of that baritone club, along with Hugh Cornwell and the song Peaches, which I've tried to persuade him to perform with me a couple of times, but he's got a thing about anything that's got a prominent keyboard line in. So these days he refuses to have a keyboard in his band, and obviously staunchly refuses to once again participate in anything performance-wise under the name The Stranglers, which is a shame. But I, like many others, have said, "Come on, Hugh, come on, lighten up, get together with the other guys before they're all dead, and do a gig, and don't forget to play Peaches." No chance.
If we sort of stay in the 70s, but right at the end, and again, this is another bit of a gear change, but I have heard you talk about Foreigner before. You've chosen Head Games, obviously from the Head Games album. I mean, Foreigner's sound really was sort of, they to me, they immediately sounded like a classic band. Did you know Mick Jones previously from sort of late 60s, early 70s London, or were they new?
No, I've never met Mick Jones, and neither have many people these days, because Foreigner, on the rare occasions they've been performing together in the last years, he's sometimes not been able to show up due to ill health. So, but Lou Gramm I did meet post Foreigner when he was, well, it was actually my suggestion to get him to come and participate in 50 Years of Rock and Roll, a big German television show, and were asking for ideas as to classic rock artists that might be on the show. And I suggested Lou Gramm, who was recovering from his brain tumor at that point and just beginning to attempt to sing again. But during the time in the late 70s and early 80s, when Foreigner were in their heyday, it was very obvious to me that Lou Gramm was head and shoulders above every other rock tenor in the world. His diction was perfect, his pitch was perfect, his timing was perfect, and his ability to sing throughout his elevated tenor range was unsurpassed. So Lou, still for me, is the classic number one singer that I could never, ever. I mean, if I could be born with the voice of a supreme tenor vocalist, then Robert Plant would be an easy pick. But I think I'd go first with Lou Gramm, simply because of his expertise and his phrasing and his diction. You hear every word the guy sings.
That's the final choice tonight from my guest Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull.